Hello and welcome to today's webcast, API-Powered Digital Ecosystems. My name is Greg Braille. I work on the Apogee team at Google. I've worked on APIs and API management for more than 10 years as part of Apogee and now as part of Google. I will be co-presenting with Paul Schultz from BrightInsight. He's the Senior Director of Commercial Development. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items so we understand and everyone can understand the format of the webcast. You should see on your slide something resembling the webcast console. On the bottom left is the Q&A console, where you can post questions at any time during the webcast. Please note you don't have to wait until the end of the session to ask your questions. Feel free to post them anytime, and we'll try to answer them during the end or offline after the webcast. Now that I have addressed our housekeeping items, let's get started. We're going to talk a little bit about the way things are today. Again, I've been doing APIs and API management for a long time. When we started off, APIs were very much about mobile apps. They were about, oh my goodness, we gotta get on the iPhone. We have to figure out what to do about Twitter. Obviously, things have changed a lot in the intervening years, and a lot of things happened. The mobile area we've made it through. Everyone just about, except in some parts of the world, has a cell phone. They have a smartphone, and now we're very much into the age of assistance. And I think people are really expecting a truly connected digital experience, and customers are expecting a truly connected digital experience wherever they go. A great example of this, the first time we did this presentation together, we were in fabulous Las Vegas, and my flight had been delayed, so I arrived at about 1:30 in the morning to the Las Vegas hotel, which are all extraordinarily large. And there I stood in a line with about 20 people for about half an hour while one person stood behind a computer terminal and tap it in order to get us into our hotel rooms at 1:30 in the morning. And this was very much not what any of us were expecting, because many of us had come here. Some of us took a Lyft or Uber to the airport. I didn't, but they did. Some of us went through the airport security using Clear, which only took a few minutes. We scanned our electronic boarding pass. When the flight was delayed, even though it was frustrating, I knew every minute of the day where my incoming flight was, where my seat was going to be, whether there was a delay, whether the gate changed. We had a beautiful digital experience till we got to the hotel and it all fell apart. And the truth is that people really expect that kind of experience these days, and today's consumers really expect that. Things have really changed. The world was revolutionized by mobile, but now it's a lot more than mobile. It's digital assistance. It's the apps in your car. People find the navigation in your car that was so wonderful 5 years ago. People who drive Teslas, laugh at it, right? People expect so much now, and I think what we're trying to figure out is, as businesses, how can we create new digital experiences? How can we keep up with this customer demand? These customers are curious, and as it says here, they're also impatient, right? And we're going to talk about developers later on. I always like to say that developers are also impatient. But we'll start by talking about the customers, because that's where things really matter. Now, as we've been doing this, we've noticed that customers who are doing this sort of digital transformation, they go on a journey. They start with something simple, and this is also kind of how things have changed over time. But I think every company who's going through some sort of digital journey, who didn't, just start off last year, but who's actually been in business for some time, has to go through some of these stages. And this diagram also shows a lot of the ways in which people deploy APIs and deploy API management technologies. They start off needing to solve a basic integration problem, like I have legacy systems, I have mainframes, I have systems I built in the 90s or the 2000s or the 2010s that I need to be able to connect together to actually deliver new experiences. And then very quickly I need to provide access. How am I going to make a mobile app out of these services? How am I going to plug them into Google Assistant, or the thing from the other company, or the smart cars, or you name it, right? But where it gets much more interesting is when we create those differentiated digital experiences. Something even like Clear, which is basically a digital experience that you go through at the airport as you go through security. There's an app behind that. It's even though you're interacting with people and you're using your iris and your fingers to get on the airplane, you're actually making it a completely digital experience when you get there. And that makes it, very interesting and differentiated, and it's a great new business for them. The real transformation starts to come all the way up on the right when people are starting to be able to adopt new platforms. And how you do that, and how you change your business, and how you adopt technology to do that is a much more difficult question, and that's what we're going to talk a little more about, and as we talk in this presentation about digital ecosystems and how to create them. So, why is that important? Well, it's kind of obvious, but you want to do this to grow your business. And there are a couple of different reasons that you might want to do this. If you're all in and you're ready to embark on a journey in this, you might want to ask the question, why do I have a digital ecosystem? Is this just a trend? Am I just trying to keep up with everyone else? And the truth is that if you really build an ecosystem, you can connect on a much deeper level with your customers. You can have an integrated end-to-end experience, and your customers can learn more, and you can learn more about them. And part of this is because you can more easily create these digital experiences, new kinds of applications. And the other thing is that you can actually work now with a wider variety of partners, a wider variety of end users, and you can have a wider variety of business-to-business contexts, because now you have a platform that allows all of these different kind of organizations to interact with you in the way that's appropriate for them. So, for instance, a technology partner or even a very sophisticated B2B customer may need to interact with your platform in one way. They may require very stable APIs with an emphasis on security. They may be able to put up with a certain amount of initial manual onboarding, like, hey, we have to manually exchange digital certificates because what we're doing here is extremely high value. On the other hand, individual developers, if those are your targets, they're going to be interested in moving very quickly. They're going to be interested in doing things via self-service on a web platform, and they may have different needs. They may want to see, an API presented in a certain way that makes a lot of sense to them and the technology they work with, whereas your technology partners or your aggregators or even your B2B customers may want something completely different. So I think by creating this kind of ecosystem, you now have the ability to enter into business in whole new ways. And the thing that holds it all together, no big surprise, is the API and the API platform. This is something that's changed a lot in the last few years, but we've seen the percentage of enterprises who deploy APIs both internally and externally has been growing for the last couple of years. I don't remember the exact numbers, but certainly a majority of companies now have external APIs, and something like 80 or some percent of companies have APIs inside the enterprise that they use to build these sorts of platforms for their own use. So how do we actually build this digital ecosystem? So let's actually talk about a couple of phases and some strategies. First thing is your business strategy. Why are you doing this? It seems like an obvious question, but if you don't get it right, then it's hard to do everything after that. Are you going for brand awareness? By having a digital ecosystem, by having this API platform, do we just want to get our name out there, or are we actually trying to do it to make money? And if you're doing it to make money, what is your monetization strategy? You can charge per API call. Companies that have extremely valuable data or an extremely valuable service are able to do this. But on the other hand, companies who are trying to do something a little bit different, it may be less about charging for the API call and more about getting partners or other platforms to build new applications for their platform that drives business to their existing lines of business. So those are all very interesting questions. One may be simply, we want to have this API-powered digital ecosystem so we can innovate more quickly on our customer experience. That's an extremely valuable one, and one that all kinds of brands have done. Then the next one, obviously, is what's in your ecosystem. Why is somebody going to want to be your partner and join your ecosystem? So, one example we have and we've spoken about as Apogee before is AccuWeather. They're the weather forecasting company. They have APIs that you can use to get weather forecasts from anywhere in the world. And they offer those to developers. But the actual API that says, on your watch or your phone, it's 47 degrees out, that's an interesting API, but it's not like they're the only person to get that API. But they also have very highly valuable API data that are used in industries that depend a lot on the weather, like financial services and insurance and agriculture, where they need very accurate forecasts that are very specific and targeted to their industry. That's actually worth quite a bit of money, and they're actually able to have APIs for those kinds of forecasts as well, and they're able to monetize those APIs in a more straightforward way because it's extremely uniquely valuable content. On the other hand, another customer we've talked about before, Ticketmaster, they sell tickets for online events, and they have a pretty decent and growing percentage of ticket sales. It's like 17 or 18% that happen from third-party applications built on top of their platform. Now, that wouldn't work for them if they've charged everybody 5 cents to sell a ticket on their platform, because their business is to sell more tickets on their platform. So they're more interested in how do we get developers to build on our ecosystem and to actually grow it and drive more traffic to our existing business. And finally, we got to talk about the developer experience. How do you actually make it easy for the developer? I talked earlier about how different kinds of developers need a different experience. But no matter what it is, we talked about customers being impatient and busy. Developers are even more so. A developer who has a choice between 2 or 3 platforms they can build on is going to want to pick the one that they can get going with the most quickly, that's the most like the kinds of platforms they like to work with. If they're a mobile developer, they're going to expect APIs and an interface that makes sense to a mobile developer. If they're a web developer, it might be slightly different. If they're an enterprise developer, they might be asking questions about how do I customize this data? How do I ensure that there's no data leakage? What is the encryption strategy? What is your SLA? What is your SLO? The mobile developer might be thinking more about how good are the docs, how fast is the API, does it work in all the regions where I'm going to be, is it easy to learn, does it work with my development stack? There are all kinds of different things to discuss here, and I think that's where the fun of building an API platform really comes in. So that's enough of me talking. I think we should go moving from talking about APIs to talking about things like connected eyedroppers. And for that, we have here Paul Schultz from BrightInsight, and I'm going to turn things over to him, and he's going to speak for a bit.
Thank you, Greg. So before we get started talking about use cases with BrightInsight, I wanted to talk a little bit about the company. So BrightInsight was spun out of a company called Flex, a $24 billion global sketch-to-scale design and solution provider that designs and develops products for customers, translates into over $100 billion in the global marketplace. It's likely one of the largest companies you may have never heard of. The company Flex, our parent company, is industry agnostic. They operate in 12 industries, each with a little over $2 billion in revenue, from automotive to telecommunications to healthcare. Their portfolio is unparalleled and really gets a lens to the new digital world. So essentially, if you walk into a hospital or a Best Buy, the majority of those products have either been designed or manufactured by Flex. And in the healthcare space, Flex is essentially designing and manufacturing a lot of the products that are going to come out in the next 5 to 10 years. And everything is IoT, connecting and unlocking new data sets. But where's that data going? And they saw a lot of pharma and medtech companies were homegrowing their infrastructure. So they saw an opportunity, but they didn't have the team. So they brought in a world-class team to bring BrightInsight to market. And BrightInsight, our core product, is the leading regulated IoT platform for biopharma and medtech. Since launching in 2008 in partnership with Google Cloud, we have secured a little over a dozen large cap biopharma and medtech customers, including Novo Nordisk, one of the largest diabetes companies in the world, as well as Roche Genentech. And when you look at our customer base of about 200 life science companies, the market is huge, represents about a $10 billion market opportunity. And our pre-built platform, purpose-built platform built on Google Cloud is API microservices driven, offering a robust, scalable, and customized functionality for our life science customers. So just reflecting back on Greg's 3 pillars of the API digital ecosystem. The first is really, as Greg had mentioned, the business case. When we look in the life science space, there really is no IoT platform that's really purpose-built to solve these regulated digital health use cases. And as I had mentioned, a lot of these companies were building their own homegrown infrastructures that were siloed and didn't integrate with the broader healthcare ecosystem. And the second piece is that value equation. So really having access to a regulated IoT platform that is API driven, that conforms with high privacy, security, and regulatory standards will unlock a number of very large opportunities for biopharma and medtech. And at BrightInsight, we tailor every BrightInsight environment for each of our customers. So having Apogee as the API lifecycle management solution is fundamental and allows our customers to have those capabilities out of the box. Now let's take a look at a real use case. So if we look at diabetes, close to 500,000 people have diabetes, yet close to half of them are unable to adequately control their condition. And this is primarily caused by poor medication adherence. Why? Because essentially the methods for patients to get to adequate glycemic control are antiquated. If we look at the US specifically, it can take up to 3 years for a type 2 diabetic patient to get to glycemic control. Patients have to go to their doctor, and the doctor adjusts the insulin dose based on their glucose levels. And it can take up to 3 years because the doctor does not want to overprescribe and cause a hyperglycemic event. And in order to address this challenge, Novo Nordisk, one of the largest diabetes companies in the world, leverages BrightInsight to power all of their regulated digital health offerings to millions of diabetes patients in over 180 countries. You can think of BrightInsight as the plumbing to which Novo Nordisk can build their regulated digital health solutions on top of, where BrightInsight takes on all the privacy, security, and regulatory compliance to allow these solutions to get to market. This allows Novo Nordisk to integrate their new connected insulin pens, integrate data from third-party glucose meters, and develop adaptive dosing algorithms that automatically titrate the insulin based on glucose levels without a doctor, getting the diabetic patient to insulin dose in 3 months, not 3 years, with an improved quality of life. But building and maintaining a regulated IoT platform in a highly regulated life science industry is incredibly complex. While there are huge opportunities, there are really 5 key areas that make this a really hard problem to solve. I'll walk through these briefly. The first is just the cloud. Public cloud is evolving constantly, changes up to 5 times a day, and there's no version control. So that's a compliance risk when we start to build these types of API-driven solutions. The second is regulatory. There's a complex regulatory environment. There's a lot of uncertainty there, and there's a huge investment required in understanding that space. Security and privacy are also critical as we're dealing with sensitive patient identifiable information. Having an understanding of the security and privacy landscape is paramount. There's a ton of data coming from these new regulated IoT devices, and very challenging and complex to make sense of that data, as well as defining the system and user capabilities as well for these particular applications. So just going back to how we've solved for that at BrightInsight, it's really been driven by microservices, where many different microservices come together to provide functionality for our customers. And this model is heavily dependent on all these APIs to come together to offer all of the functionality. And having an API gateway like Apogee enables BrightInsight to provide that easy-to-use interface so that our customers don't have to, they don't have to access every single one of those microservices individually. And the other power of BrightInsight being API-driven is that we can be agnostic to the source of the data, the intended use, and the therapeutic area that allows us to support a large breadth and depth of regulated digital health use cases for our customers. We're integrating across different data sources, whether it's an app, an algorithm, a connected medical device, or a drug delivery solution. We're also applying all that data in many different ways. The intended use of that data driving value for patients and for providers, everything from dosing algorithms that can automatically titrate the dose of a particular therapy, or clinical decision support algorithms that are essentially understanding and recommending particular therapeutic pathways for the patients. And then finally, triaging high-risk patients based on data from the patient, from biometric sensors, and potentially from their electronic medical records. And all of this can come across therapeutic areas, whether it's neurology, immunology, diabetes, and oncology, among many others. And by integrating across many pharma and medtech companies, we're empowering an open ecosystem. So we're integrating these devices into the broader healthcare ecosystem through this API lifecycle management. For example, in the US, there are about 850 payers, each with their own disease management solutions. All of these are going to have to tap into this data in a seamless way. There are over 600,000 US hospitals that also have their own disease management solution platforms. So having an API layer where they can extract that data and make sense of it for their disease management programs is going to be critical. And BrightInsight is essentially building the plumbing to integrate all of these devices throughout the healthcare system. So looking at Apogee now, in terms of the broader ecosystem here, what we're doing for Novo, we're doing for many large cap biopharma and medtech companies with many different data types and device types. In order for us to better serve our customers with multiple products at scale, we need to be able to do that in a way that we're not building custom solutions for each customer. And so by leveraging Apogee and their API lifecycle management platform, we're able to offer all of these capabilities out of the box. So when we think about this from Novo Nordisk perspective, the APIs that we're leveraging right now, our team is developing those solutions for Novo Nordisk, leveraging our APIs. And as we start to scale, the APIs will then get integrated with the broader healthcare ecosystem. So payers, hospitals, and others that need to make sense of that data from Novo Nordisk can tap into that. And then finally, as we start to mature and offer or expose our APIs to third-party developers, they will then have a robust system of APIs through Apogee to be able to develop solutions on top of BrightInsight. And with the ecosystem, the value is delivered. So by having an API strategy, we're able to reduce the development efforts for our customers by up to 70%, leveraging these pre-built microservices. We accelerate our customers' time to market by up to 6 to 24 months by developing all of these deep APIs under design controls for these regulated digital health use cases. And extremely scalable to meet our current and future customer needs, with as many as 20 million API calls being powered per day per customer product, allowing us to drive scale across products globally for our customers. So that's an overview of BrightInsight and how we're leveraging API lifecycle management to not only develop a platform that's scalable for our customers, but offer the ability to extract that data across the broader ecosystem for our customers.
Thank you, Paul. That was very helpful. So just to reiterate for one sec, we talked about the 3 pillars of the ecosystem. We talked about having an important business case, having something in it for the people who are going to join your ecosystem, and making it easy for those developers to join. Now, we talked a little bit about sort of the abstract stuff, and we talked a little bit about a real use case. At Apogee, we actually try to do this for a whole variety of customers in a whole variety of industries. And what I want to talk a little bit about is sort of the infrastructure that we use and a little bit about the technology that you need to think about when you're deploying something like this. We're not going to make this a super technical webinar, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the bits and pieces. Now, a big part of it, it's technology, but it's technology at a high level, is this concept of API product management. We talk about this a lot at Apogee now, because an API is just a tool. An API is just, a way to use HTTP to have something talk to something else. What makes an API into something that you can use to create a digital ecosystem is when you turn that API into a product. And without making that API a product, just like having a phone is, it's a great phone, but if there's not an ecosystem around it, how are you going to buy it, how are you going to service it, when are you going to replace it, what apps are on it, it's just a phone, right? So it's the same with APIs. We need to actually turn these things into products. so that we can get them in front of the partners and the customers and the end users who make them such an important part of what we do. So, really what we talk about here are how API products, they're usually a bundle of APIs, and they include not just the core technology of, HTTPS post to this endpoint will result in, sending your diabetes information to the medical center, but, how, for instance, is that API designed so that developers can get access to it? Are there maybe multiple API designs or multiple styles of APIs or API security for multiple consumers? Even things like, how is it published? How does a developer discover that API? How does a developer sign up for that API? Is there a team of API onboarding experts or API product managers who decide who's allowed to use the API, what their quota is, what their security requirements are, or is it something that's automatic? Do you want to offer different levels of service, multi-geographical access, lower latency options, guaranteed SLA? Do you want to have quotas? In fact, you should have quotas to protect your API from abuse and be able to offer that tiers of service and ensure that either on purpose or by accident, no one runs over. How does the API product manager actually know how all of this is happening? So as your API program gets bigger and bigger, it may be that it's an architect or a developer who's just kind of looking at some screens every once in a while. But as your program gets bigger, this becomes more and more, a pretty significant and a pretty significant job where someone is actually, like for any product, looking every day at what is the adoption of the API, what is the traffic of the API, who are the new consumers, who has built an app on our API who's had a whole lot of traffic today? What's changed? Are there anomalies? Did someone who was using the API before suddenly stop using the API? Should we get in touch with them? There's a whole lot of things that come up here. And this is why, sort of the business of API management is very much around productizing APIs and not just giving access to the basic digital technology. So this gets into a few things about API management. And this is a short section. I just wanted to talk briefly about some of the things we've heard about APIs and API management over the years and why we might want to think about them a little differently. And the first one is that when people talk about API management, they start talking about API gateways. And API gateways are extremely important in a lot of infrastructure. So for instance, almost everyone who's doing microservices, who has a collection of small bits of functionality that they have to expose to some other team or externally, or anyone who's using something like a serverless platform, where if you're going to the complete microservices extreme, you have one serverless function to insert something into the customer database, another one to scan from the customer database, and another one to insert something into the database of health records or whatever. In a pure serverless, pure microservices architecture, those might be three different services. But you don't want the people outside your organization to know about those three different services. So typically you put some sort of facade in front of them that make them look like one abstraction, and that's where API gateways fit in. But once we start talking about how we're going to share that API outside the team or outside the organization, how do we control how people sign up? How do we set quotas? How do we monitor how the API is used? Now you're really managing your API as a product, and you're doing API product management, and now you're doing API management. You need a policy enforcement point for API management. That's what the API gateway is. But an API gateway alone doesn't give you API management. And as you scale up your platform and scale up your ecosystem, you're going to find very quickly that you really need both. Second one is that, and of course, many of our examples today were about public APIs because we're talking about ecosystems. But we don't just mean public APIs like anyone in the world can sign up for my API and build an app like they could in the early days of Twitter. Many of these APIs, and in fact, most of the most productive APIs, are not shared with the general public. They're shared with specific partners. There may even be agreements about which partners can see which APIs can sign up, how they sign up. The sign-up process is completely up to the product manager. And many, if not most APIs, are strictly internal to an organization or a group of organizations. Any time that groups of developers are building services that they want to share with other groups of developers, in my opinion, that's an API. And once you have APIs and you start sharing them with people, once you're sharing them with more than 5 or 6 people, having some sort of platform to help you do that becomes extremely important. So that's why when we talk about API management, sometimes the examples are about, cool public APIs like the AccuWeather API, but the most value that people are getting out of them are inside their organizations. You can think about a large multinational corporation, one that may operate in many countries, that may have grown via acquisition. The internal ecosystem of that company is so complicated, it's not all that different from the internet. And it makes just as much sense to have these things like self-service API boarding and API product management, excellent documentation on all those kinds of things for those APIs as well. And the last one is really, we talk a little bit about, again, with public APIs, sort of an extension of this is, API management is about having an API store. People should be able to buy my API on a web page. And that's interesting, and it's one possible way to build things with APIs. But it's only a small part, and I think there are a whole lot of more interesting things you can do. So basically, when we talk about how we're going to manage APIs and how we're going to create these API platforms, the bit of technology that they all need is called full lifecycle API management. That's actually the official, Gartner-approved terminology, and you can look at it. But we really, we call it that because we want to make it clear that the API gateway is sort of the necessary enabling technology, and that's where you start. So once you actually build out into full lifecycle API management, that's where you have things like the developer ecosystem. That is the API consumer management. That's the basis of all this. How do I define my API products? How do I get them to clients? Do I want to monetize them? All that kind of thing. Then on the right, we have that API gateway, which is about the runtime policy enforcement. And that can include, it has to include things like security and traffic management. But it may also include things like orchestration and transformation, because you may be adapting to systems that aren't exactly the API you want to expose. And then the third major category of a full lifecycle API management system is a monitoring system and an analytics system. So those API product managers can understand how well the API is doing for the business, as well as how well the API is supporting the ecosystem and supporting the customer. So if you have a dissatisfied customer, your first way for you to know that is not that all of a sudden your API traffic drops and they don't renew their contract with you, but that you can actually tell that, their error rate has been creeping up, or their latency has been creeping up, or they're having a problem in a specific geography, or something unusual happened today. And actually, that last use case reminds me of sort of our very last thing, which is that where a lot of companies, including Google, are going with these things is figuring out how to bring more and more interesting data and even policy enforcement to your APIs using AI and using machine learning. So for instance, anomaly detection is a great case, and it's something that's now part of the Apogee platform, where you can be notified as an API product manager or an API operator of a sudden change in an error rate or a latency or even a particular application's use of an API. Other ones that we're doing in Google Cloud, we have some very interesting APIs around data protection, where they can use machine learning to actually look at the content of APIs and tell you if they contain personally identifiable information that shouldn't be there. And this is actually an interesting use case because it's actually one of those API use cases. We often talk about checking the things that come into your API. If you're accepting JSON from an untrusted developer, how do you know that someone didn't structure that in some crazy way to design to crash your API platform? The data protection is a use case that's very interesting, because now we're also thinking about the data that's going out. Did some developer inside my application accidentally build an application that puts the social security number of the customer in every API response? Well, the data protection API from Google would actually help you catch that and help you understand and limit your losses and understand the impact of something like that happening. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening all over Google Cloud in this area, and we're focusing more and more within Apogee on how we can apply these kinds of problems to the world of API management. And with that, I actually don't have a conclusion slide, but we've talked about digital platforms, digital ecosystems, how to build them. We had a great example of a company that's actually done it in real life. And we've talked a bit about the specific technology and how that might work. So with that, we're actually done with the main content part of the webinar, and we're going to answer some questions. And I see we have some questions already. So why don't I start with the first one, which is to say, hey, API management seems like it's really only for public APIs. I don't have public APIs. I don't have external people using my APIs. Why do I need any of this? And I'll answer that because this is a question we get all the time. But I think, and I tried to answer it a few slides ago as well, I think once your organization becomes even moderately complex, once you're sharing things, you need some sort of way to manage them as products and control how they're being produced and consumed. You even need a way to do things. Now, maybe the requirements are a little different. So, for instance, internally, you also may want to have control over the API publication process. You may want to put a life cycle in place that gives rules around when a team creates an API, how they make sure it conforms with the design standards, how they guarantee it enforces the security standards, how do they make sure that we have, that we've followed all the steps in the software development lifecycle. So we're looking into ways that people do a lot of this with Apogee now, and that's an area of future growth for our product, I think. The next one's about BrightInsight. Where is BrightInsight on its API journey, and what are the future plans? And for that, I think we can definitely turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, so in terms of where we are on our API journey, we started with developing the fundamental API building blocks that are reusable core components across all of our customer use cases. So things like identity access management, patient consent, it's kind of the shell of the car, things that we don't want to recreate the wheel on, that are not public APIs. These are private APIs that our teams internally are leveraging to develop solutions on top of BrightInsight. So we've built that fundamental core set of building blocks. Going forward, we want to be able to start to expose those APIs to some system integration third-party partners that will be trained on those APIs and leverage them to build solutions on top of BrightInsight to extend our professional services capability. And then the second is integrating into the broader healthcare ecosystem by having APIs and an API lifecycle management solution. We're able to then expose those APIs to the broader ecosystem, including other hospitals, payers, and others in the ecosystem that would benefit from the data that we're capturing.
Great, thanks. Okay, here's one. Do I need API management for microservices? Or, and I think there's another one in here, what's the difference between API management and microservices? And I'll take this, but you might have an opinion too. But the way I look at it, if you're following the true microservices philosophy as espoused by the people who live and breathe this stuff, microservices are a way for a team to decide how to deliver their service. So you may have a service, the customer service, and you may deliver it with a mainframe or with a J2EE app running on an app server, or you may deliver it with 100 microservices. And whether the team chooses to deliver it with 100 microservices or 7 microservices or 23 microservices, that can't matter to the people who use the service who are outside that team. Otherwise, the whole world falls apart. So in my opinion, microservices are how you structure individual services. But once you share those services between teams, and certainly between organizational units or outside the company, then you've got APIs. And I think that's sort of this world of where there are big APIs and some of them are implemented as microservices is kind of where a lot of people are going. And to me, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's...
Does that comport with your experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And everything that we're doing is container-based microservices, and that's how we consider them internally. As we start to extend to the broader ecosystem, there'll be APIs. Cool.
So it's a common one. I think we have done a webinar about this. Maybe we'll do another one. Here's another question. What factors did BrightInsight what factors did BrightInsight use when selecting Apogee as the API management solution? So thank you for selecting Apogee. But it's wonderful to hear from you kind of
absolutely.
How you went through that process.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was operating in a highly regulated life science industry. We had to take security into consideration when selecting an API lifecycle management solution. And And one of the things that we really liked about Apogee was that it was fully integrated with GCP, and GCP having defense in depth security, both for data at transit and default, was critical as we looked to ensure that all the data was highly protected and had the highest level of security as we look to expose these APIs through Apogee.
Cool. And I want to remind everybody, you can use the Q&A panel on your screen to ask more questions, and if we don't get to them, we can get to them later on offline. I actually thought of something to ask you as I was hearing your presentation. You mentioned that in a regulated industry, it seems like there's a risk that you take when you work on a public cloud provider that is shipping new versions of things, and maybe some of that is regulatory, and that you've taken some steps to minimize that risk. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and that's another thing that we're working on in partnership with Google Cloud, which is ultimately with the public cloud changing and being so dynamic and fluid, those changes of the underlying GCP components, whether it's Apogee, Spanner, BigQuery, could cause a break change to a platform on top. And so that's a concern to the global regulatory bodies if there's an algorithm providing life-saving therapy to a patient.
Right.
And so we're building the first and only compliant cloud change control process in partnership with Google to be able to address that concern, where it's kind of a check engine light, where we can check all of the underlying components, ensure everything is operating to our highest level of requirements before pushing any changes to production. And having an API-driven platform allows us to do that at scale, because we have these core components that we can run all of those automated tests. So,
okay.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. That's something I had actually not heard of a few years ago, so it's very interesting that you're working on solving that problem.
It's very exciting.
And if anyone else has a similar problem, maybe they should get in touch with you and learn more about
Absolutely.
it. One other one I'm going to ask you, and then I think we're going to actually end the questions after that, which is, we talked a little bit about optimizing APIs for different types of consumers. At least I talked about that a little bit, and how they have different needs.
Yep.
Have you seen any of this in your world, where, someone in, obviously an IoT device has different requirements than a system that runs in a hospital or something?
Yeah, I think it's more of the user type. So internally, we have to structure our APIs so that they're easy for our internal teams to use and scale and develop. As we start to look at others in the ecosystem, whether it's Anthem or Aetna that wants to leverage data from the connected devices in the broader BrightInsight ecosystem for their own programs, we have to provide a different experience or API experience for that particular user. Or if it's one of our system integration partners that's going to be developing solutions on top of BrightInsight, they have to have a different experience as well. And so offering the flexibility of having different experiences for different end users through an API lifecycle management solution is critical for us as we scale beyond just internal microservices.
Okay, great. I think with that, we're gonna bring the questions to an end. It was great talking to you all.
Thank you, Greg.
Feel free to contact us online if you have any more questions, and stay tuned. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.